I'm very honored to be here. I'm a maternal fetal medicine specialist, as Ray mentioned, and I have been working with the fetus for the last 20 years. I'm not so much at that age. I have to change my glasses to see my computer screen, so that's not a sign of youth exactly. I have been working in the fetal perspective for many years, and our group has become very big, so we are covering different aspects of fetal physiology and the brain and cardiovascular development, and so we'll be speaking about different things, and some of them I'm not an expert in. So Ray looked at me at a TED talk about brain that put a lot of pressure on me because I had to speak in front of many people that were more experts than me, and now I'm doing that again. There are people here who knows much more about the brain than myself. So I will try to give an overview of what we have been doing, and since I'm very obedient and compliant with what I'm told, I will say that I have no financial relationships to disclose. And then I will start, and as I say, I will focus it from essentially clinical perspective, and I will explain you what we did over the last 10, 15 years. There should be a clock running here, but it's not running, so I will not be aware if I'm running over time. This is an email that I got, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago from he's the father of someone who was born with us, and he says that I was at your institution, my child, William is the name, had mild growth restriction. You even proposed me to participate in a clinical study, and now he's almost 6 and he's suffering these problems with learning and irritable mood with intolerance to frustration. And do you think that could have a relationship with this prenatal problem? And of course, our answer, my answer could be, well, I know exactly that could be due to many other causes, but definitely what we know is that there is a higher prevalence of these problems in children like yours, and I think that is exactly what is going on. So prenatal conditions are really influencing neurodevelopment, and I am not discovering anything here. That's why we are here sitting. I started doing fetal surgery 20 years ago, and our main concern at that time was whether we were doing a lot of harm to the fetal brain. And the general concept, at least that fetal medicine specialists had at that time, and I think many pediatricians did as well, was that the fetal brain was had a lot of plasticity, so it could adapt very well to whatever insults, and as long as we were not destroying a lot of the brain, that the things were going okay, because these children were born and everything was okay. The truth is that when we started comparing our fetuses with controls, we discovered that in the controls, there were a lot of fetuses suffering as well neurodevelopmental problems. And the reason was that we were using twins for controls, because twin pregnancy is one of the indications for fetal surgery, and there is a lot of growth restriction in these twins. So at that time, we said, okay, maybe there is something more going on. And of course, today we have a completely different idea. And it makes a lot of sense that these children that are suffering intrauterine environmental problems are having issues in the construction of their organs. And of course, as I say, I am not a super expert at all in the development of the brain before birth, but there are many programs going on, from migration, programming, fetal death, myelination, and all these developmental events follow programs in the genes that when exposed to an abnormal environment are going to change. We have described that much better for the heart, but it should be the same for the brain. So many years ago, and then we started thinking that we and many other people, of course, that even a mild injury should influence this construction of this very complex organ. And there are a lot of events that are biochemical, and there are experts that will speak about that later, that could be altered at that time. And even if you don't see that, they could become evident when the baby is born at 2 years, maybe at 10 years of age. And I'm sure some of the speakers that will follow me will talk much better about that. So there is a fetal programming when something is not working. I always make this stupid example of that you have a program and you need 100 pieces to build the brain, and I will talk mainly about fetal growth restriction, which is the deprivation. I will advance myself a little bit, not much, to the next session. And you have 100 pieces, and this is a very simplistic approach, of course, and then they give you 80. So what do you do? If you were a PC, you would just hang, and if it's a Mac, maybe it would last for a little bit more, but in the end it would happen the same. But then you have epigenetics for that, to correct for that. But some things will change for sure. So the program will not be, you will survive, you will adapt to the environment, but something will have changed that will make you different. And that's essentially the concept that we have worked with. And we know that there are a lot of conditions that can happen prenatally that do not need to be really severe diseases, like restriction of fetal growth that is normally due to deprivation of nutrients more than oxygen, and prematurity, exposure to toxics, infections, and of course there are genetic disorders, definitely. And that's a very rough estimation, and we have always mentioned, I think there is fair agreement, that if you have 1 in 10 children with learning disabilities in a developed country or area, about 2/3 would probably be of prenatal origin. So that's a great opportunity for intervention. The concept is that you have fetal life, and of course this programming, this remodeling, it's taking place not only in fetal life, and you know very well that the brain construction is prolonged later. I don't know if there is a way of stop seeing me here, but I will put it. Yeah, sorry. I am so concentrated in the presentation that I didn't realize. I'm sorry. And that's exactly what I was saying. So the problem will become evident later, and all of you who work with children know that they are born, they look very nice to parents. When a child is born, it just needs to cry and eat, and that's quite easy. But after 2 or 3 years, then the most severe cases become evident. Some of them become evident at 6, 8 years, and all these problems of learning, relationships, social integration become evident. But the problem started here, and what concerns us. So the idea was there should be a window of opportunity where you can change that. That has been shown with early intervention or stimulation programs for preterm babies, and has been clearly shown for other organs, for example, for cardiac function, that you can really work in particularly if you work very early in life, and that's been shown in animal models. So there are some windows that are closed later in life, so you cannot go there anymore. It's like an engine that you can put your hands in for some time, but at some point it will get closed, so you will not be able to change anything else. And the problem is that you don't know that the engine is wrong until it starts working years later. So we have been working on, say, okay, how can we identify risk? And is there a way to, within these risk groups, to find some biomarkers that could help us to understand what is going on and maybe predict and maybe help the interventions that we will be doing in this modern 4P medicine that must be predictive and preventive and personalized and participatory? That's the way of medicine we are trying to go after. I don't know if that's good for happiness, but at least that's what society demands. But that's a different discussion. I will focus on providing some evidence that we have been constructing among different groups over the last years to show how this prenatal life influences postnatal life. And I will mainly focus on fetal growth restriction, which is this disease that will be much better explained later, where the fetus is not reaching its potential for growth, normally because there is a restriction of nutrients. In the end, it also becomes an oxygen problem. But in the beginning, the placenta is feeding the baby and it's providing the respiratory functions of the baby. But in the beginning, it's just nutrients. So I will, and fetal growth restriction induces programming at all levels. Because the whole body has to change. You have to weigh 3 kilograms and you're weighing 2 kilograms. Your whole body has been reprogrammed, and this is affecting your cardiovascular function, your metabolism. But let's focus on the brain because we are in a brain event, and that's what I will do. And it's so clear that growth restriction creates problems in children. These are, and some of you may be experts in neurodevelopment. I am not, but we have a lot of psychologists working with us. And so these two infants, they are 1.5 years more or less, have been taught to take out the small fish from the bottle, and the one on the top learns after a few tries to put his hand or her hand in the bottle. She learns that she has to turn the bottle upside down. The other one is really not achieving the same. I mean, she's distracted all the time. She has attention problems. She's a little bit excited, and this person here is the same because she's the mother. They are twins, and then she at that time discovers that they are not the same because she was absolutely convinced that they were doing well. But then she's shocked to see how this is one of the many tests that, as you know, are done in these children. So this is a computer that we don't know whether it works well or bad until we force it at that age. We will discover when we go to school, but now these children are just playing around and they look nice to the mother, to the family, to the pediatrician, but then they are shocked when they come to us and discover that they are actually very different. And the only difference is that one of these twins that were born at 34 weeks was smaller than the other one. And she was reassured that everything was going to be okay because the neonatology unit, everything went well. She went home very quickly. She didn't have respiratory problems. The ultrasound was normal. And this difference has been illustrated by many different groups in the world, and it persists over time. So we have described until 6 years of age, but there's a big group in Israel who has followed these kids up to 18 years, and other groups. You can find similar information with preterm born, and we are having a lot of information on cardiac disease, and several other speakers will speak about that. But focusing on small fetuses, that's a consistent evidence that they are not doing as good as they should for their controls who were born with normal weight. And growth restriction is really a problem because we have 8 to 10% of pregnancies affected with this problem. So it's a big number. It doesn't mean that all these future infants and children will be handicapped, of course, but there is a big disadvantage. And the number of school failures in this population is remarkable, and that creates a lot of distress and waste of resources, and it's the #1 cause of lost hours of work in mothers. There are some studies showing that. So it's a serious problem. That's one of our studies on the distribution of growth restriction. Doesn't matter, I just put it here for aesthetical purposes. But we were working for years to say, okay, how could we predict this, and how could we characterize that? I will very briefly mention that we try to see, is there a way, you know that in fetal medicine we are doing all sorts of Doppler studies in these fetuses. We can look at the umbilical artery, we can look at the middle cerebral artery, all these changes when these fetuses are in uterus. So when there is fetal growth restriction, the umbilical artery gets more and more higher resistance because the placenta is sick. And then you immediately see this vasodilation in the brain because there is redistribution due to the lack of nutrients or oxygen. Then later on, there are some other vessels that are changing. I will not go in detail because I think that's not very relevant to the talk. But and then we have looked at, can we really predict which of these kids will do well or bad? And we looked at all these Dopplers. We looked very much in the brain. This is the Willis circle, and we look at all different arteries, and we have published how they change during the deterioration of these fetuses. We have developed some mathematical models to calculate perfusion, and we did all sorts of studies that you can imagine on fetal cardiac function to see if there was a relationship. And what we found is that there is not a good way in clinical practice to predict which children will do well or bad after fetal growth restriction. And that's one example in which we studied different degrees of vasodilation in the anterior cerebral artery, and And these are controls. These are small fetuses, but with normal flow in the cerebral artery, and these are fetuses suffering vasodilation, which is supposed to represent a more advanced degree of deterioration. And yes, there is a relationship, but you can see this huge overlapping. So it's nice because you increase the numbers until you get significance, and then you immediately send the paper for publication. But in reality, that is not influencing clinical practice as most of the things that we publish. They are good for our CVs, not for patients. You realize that when you are 50, and that's too late to change your career. But I could reproduce this graph in 50 or 60 different papers from our group. There is always a relationship, but when you think, could we use that for discriminating for, it's not working. So we don't have to lose hope, as I will say in the end, but we can identify well the problem, but we cannot tell parents, your baby will be the one who has the problem or not. And of course, I introduce here the concept that definitely prenatal environment is one part of neurodevelopment, and you know that very well. It could be to say, we could simplify. I like to simplify things and say, you have to think that your intelligence will be 1/3 prenatal life, 1/3 your first years of age, and 1/3 your genes. So even if your parents are quite stupid, there is still hope. But the environment after birth is critical, and then you can revert many things and still your genes, so it's not the same. So there is an influence, of course, but there are many things that will eventually determine whether you are having problems or not. The other line that we try to pursue was, okay, how can we understand what's going on in this brain? And again, could we develop, if we cannot look at these changes that we're using in clinical practice for monitoring these fetuses, why don't we go to the brain and see what's going on, try to understand, and maybe we could develop some biomarkers that could be useful as well to say to these parents, okay, your child is really at risk and you should do something. And we have been working in many different aspects, and I will go very quickly, but from whatever perspective you look at these brains, they are different. Sometimes you understand what you're seeing and sometimes not. These are techniques that we use for quantitative analysis of the signal of the ultrasound. We call it texture analysis, and definitely there are always differences when you look at children with and without growth restriction. And I'm sorry because I'm going relatively quick. We have looked as well how the brain is configured through the cortical development and the size of different structures of the brain, and we found that the corpus callosum is completely different already at 25, 30 weeks, so it's shorter, it's thinner, tridimensionally it's different. There are differences in the majority of sulci that you look at, and you can even construct some composite scores that predict a little bit better whether these future infants will perform good or bad at 1 or 2 years of age. So there is a correlation between prenatal cortical development and postnatal performance, again with a lot of overlapping. But definitely the concept that the brain is changing and it's not being configured normally is confirmed with all these studies. And I'm showing you graphs from our group, but you understand that this is not only work of our group. Sometimes we were the first ones, sometimes we were the third ones to say that that's relevant. The concept has been confirmed by different studies. We also evaluated, and we and others evaluated the metabolism, and when you look up with in animal models, you can look directly at the brain, of course, and look at metabolites that are relevant for neurodevelopment, and you can use as well magnetic resonance spectroscopy to look at that. And it has been described by several groups that there are changes in several of the biomarkers that you can look. One of the most typical ones is this N-acetyl aspartate, which is a neuronal marker. There are decreases in this prenatally and postnatally. There are things that we don't understand well. And an example of how complex is that field when you try to, because you create these simple theories and you say, okay, it's normal, there is less oxygen and nutrients, and there will be less N-acetyl aspartate because there are less neurons. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you find more or less, and I'm sure the experts on neurodevelopment know that much better. But just to show you an example, these are studies on fetuses, okay? And then you see how this marker, N-acetyl aspartate, in the ratio with choline is decreased. But then you go 1 year later and look at these infants and see, are they still different from their counterparts? And then you find that, yes, they are. But there is a big difference if they were born preterm or if they were term, if they were born term. If they were preterm, the N-acetyl aspartate still is lower. But if they were born at term, this marker is higher, and I don't want to go into the discussion. We wrote that in the paper. We actually don't know why, so that we wrote 2 paragraphs that were very nice from a pathophysiological point of view, but in reality, we don't understand what's going on. But this illustrates these trajectories of the neurodevelopment that I think nobody, or at least we don't understand well, and it needs to be clarified. But the only thing that this illustrates is that the trajectory in these children is different. So something happened before birth that has changed the normal trajectory. This is another line of research that will be explained by people who understand much better how it works than me. This is a mode of MRI that probably all of you know well, that is tractography, and you can delineate the tracts of these mainly newborns, because you can do that in fetuses, but it's much more challenging because the fetus is moving all the time. And then with that, you can really study the connections in the brain between different areas. You can parcellate the brain and then try to apply some graph theories, working with engineers that try to explain how the network of this brain is configured. And several groups have shown we could clearly establish that there are clear differences in the networking of this brain. It's very difficult to interpret the meaning of that because there are studies on Alzheimer, on adult disease, and they're still fighting to understand what they see. So the only thing you can say is that these brains are connected, prioritizing different areas, but the pathways that are happening are difficult to explain. But the very interesting thing is that the changes that occur shortly after birth are predictive of what will happen at 2 years of age. So there is a strong relationship. Again, that's a nice proof of how the brain changes. The other things that you could use that for clinical purposes. We thought as well that using these connectomics, we could then quantify fibers, and we, particularly clinicians, always tend to make very simplistic theories, and we say, okay, if there are problems, probably there will be less fibers, but it's not the case, as neuroscientists know. But the truth is that we have focused on some of the tracts of these fetuses, like motor networks, corticostriatal thalamic networks, and there are clear differences not in the number of fibers. That was the initial clinician-oriented problem. I said, okay, there will be less fibers. That's very easy, but that's not exactly the case. But there is, it seems to be less organization. There is reduction in fractional anisotropy that, as you probably know very well, it's a reflection of how well myelinated the fibers are, and integrity more or less is the same. So there are changes clearly in the way the organization takes place, and these changes show specific correlation with function at 2 years of age again. All this research is nice. As I said, this is a model where we are working with some groups that are experts in all these connectomics, and that's how we would like to work in the future. Say, okay, you can take a brain and look at different networks and see how well they are connected. Of course, it is very nice. I normally go to congresses with obstetricians, fetal medicine specialists, and pediatricians. They are very impressed with these videos, and that's why I put them. Not that I understand them very well. Now, there are a lot of neuroscientists here, and some of them are experts in connectomics. They will be not so impressed with that. So the initial idea was, okay, why don't we use that to illustrate, and then it would be great to understand what has gone on in this brain, so we can predict what happens, and as we intervene in the future, we can see how it recovers. But that's not as easy, of course. And I will very quickly show you that you can as well use animal models to show that. These are studies on animal models. So we are essentially a clinical group, but we collaborate with a lot of more basic or groups, and some of them that are experts in neurodevelopment, and we continually ask them what could we look at in this in our fetuses or in our experimental animals. We have an animal model that works well for more than 10 years. And they said, okay, you could look at dendritic spines. These are the spines that these dendrites have, and they are reduced in several conditions. And as you can see, it's interesting that you create growth restriction in animals or prematurity, and there is significant reduction in the number of dendritic spines, which seems to be related with learning. And if I'm not correct, please correct me, one of the experts here. We have also investigated the perineuronal nets, which seems to be as well related with neurodegeneration and learning. They are clearly reduced in these are experimental animals. So whatever, as I said, from whatever perspective you look, there is clearly an influence on the brain of these patients, or in this case, there are animals. And the good thing of animal models is that they allow you to follow your patients for a very long time relative to humans. Our cohorts now have 10 to 15 years, and we are starting some studies with 10-year patients. But of course, with animals, you can go much far away in a very short time. These are rabbits, and we follow them until adolescence, until early adulthood, and then you can reproduce the findings that you see in humans. So even in whatever animal model you use, when you restrict nutrients, the brains are configured in a different fashion, and that persists during all life, and unless you intervene, and that's what we'll discuss in the end. So that was a very brief overview. I didn't want to go into details. I just wanted to show you how these prenatal conditions, and I focused on fetal growth restriction. But the message is, okay, that's very nice. So I could show that to this parent who wrote to me at the beginning of the presentation, and he would say, that's good. I just realized that you have a very good CV, but I am left where I was. I don't know what to do with my kid, and I don't care about your CV, actually. So could we do something? And of course, I could say, maybe today we could do something. I could only say to this parent, okay, now it's probably maybe too late. I don't know. You could try to start, but if you would have started very early, maybe you would have changed. You would have changed things, because I think the concept is that there is biological programming at whatever age you are. There are epigenetics are there to work and to help you adapt. But adapting doesn't mean being better. I mean, you adapt, you survive, but you're not a better person. Normally, when you adapt to a very hard situation, you survive, but you're not better in the end. You just adapted. And that, I think, is the same for the heart, for the brain, and for whatever thing it happens during fetal life. But the good news is that, in theory, there should be a much higher or a much stronger opportunity for correction, because the epigenetic mechanisms should be there, and at least in animal models, it has been shown that you can really revert some of these epigenetic changes during a window of opportunity. We have very exciting data on the heart, but I cannot show it to you for two reasons. One is that I'm not allowed to, and the second one is that it is on brain, and if I start speaking about the heart, you will get very puzzled. But definitely there is a window of opportunity where you can revert things, and then if you wait longer, then you cannot. And that's an amazing thing of biology. And so the earlier we discover the problem, the more effective we will be to intervene. And in terms of this fetal growth restriction, it is critical because there is this slide shouldn't be here. There's, for the same reason I was mentioning, there is this window of opportunity, and we have shown, and that's completely different of what I was saying of the window of opportunity, but there is good data, and this is heart. I'm sorry, it's the only slide about the heart. But there is very good data on the heart that during childhood, you can revert the things that happen during prenatal life. And these are growth-restricted children. They suffered growth restriction in utero. When they were born, they had increased thickness in the carotid arteries. They had 0.4 as compared with 0.37. And that's what they had when they were born. And that's cardiac sphericity, another index that determines how dilated is the heart, another sign of adaptation. And when you look 5 years later, and then you have recorded the nutrition and the diet of these children and what they did. They follow breastfeeding for so many months, whatever. You see that if they followed a healthy diet, they have reduced their carotid wall thickness almost to the level of controls. But those children who were obese have even worsened. So how you are 5 years later is very much determined of how you behaved or what was your environment in the first years of life, and that goes very much in line. So let's say it's a very simplistic thing, but you are deviated from your trajectory before birth, but you could still correct it, and it will be much easier to correct it when you are only 20 miles than when you are 2,000 miles away. So if you start from Barcelona and you want to go to New York, I mean, it's quite easy to correct when you're just 100 miles away, but if you are halfway through the ocean, it's very difficult. You will end up in South America probably. And that's, I think, what happens with these biological trajectories. It's a very simplistic example, but I think it works well to understand what we're trying to say. Can you do the same with neurodevelopment? And I think it's too early to try in humans, but as I said, we have this model in rabbits. It's a very preliminary data I want to show you, but we create this growth restriction, and then, as I said, the good advantage of these patients is that you can assess histology, you can take the brains out, which you cannot do in humans for obvious reasons, and you can do MRIs and many things. And then we induce growth restriction, and then 2 years earlier we said, okay, let's try to start changing things. And we do some environmental enrichment. We give them this omega-3, docosahexaenoic, I think, acid. I have problems to pronounce it in Spanish. I'm very sorry. In English it's even worse. It's these omega-3 supplementations, lactoferrin. This is very, very initial approaches. There are many other things we could try, and we are in touch with different groups for doing that. But just to show you a glimpse, look what happens, for instance, with just environmental enrichment. So you take these rabbits, and even within in the world of rabbits, you can be an intelligent rabbit or a very dumb rabbit. And okay, we don't appreciate that, but there are ways of testing that in a very accurate manner. And you can leave them in their usual environment, or you can really introduce a number of games that stimulate these rabbits. And that has been tested in other conditions, or in rabbits, or in rats that have been that are knocked out for some genes for new development. And so looking at the rabbits, these are the controls. These are rabbits who suffer growth restriction and were left in the same environment as controls, and these are rabbits who suffer growth restriction and were hyper-stimulated or received special environmental enrichment. And you see how this is one of the tests that we do, memory, but we look at other things that I will show you. This is the global efficiency of brain networks in connectomics. These are the dendritic spines, and it's remarkable how most of these parameters seem to be corrected when you do something as simple as enriching the environment of these animals. And it seems to work well as well for lactoferrin and omega-3, and these are very simple approaches with not a very complex pathophysiological basis behind. But you see, these are the IUG are not treated, and these are treated, and you see that not all these changes are easy to understand, because why should these brain networks be different than the controls as well? Sometimes the results are similar, sometimes not, but definitely by changing the conditions before or after birth, because this is started before birth and it's given to the mother while they are pregnant, that you are changing things. And I think this gives a lot of hope that there are things that we could intervene. And that's the same, but just a brief overview that look at different groups of intervention. Look at the lower part of the slide. This is anxiety levels. You can measure anxiety in rabbits as well, and of course, anxiety is much worse. The lower score is worse, and IUGR is associated with anxiety, and then you correct it by whatever intervention you do. You can improve learning and you can improve memory. So there are clear trends, and definitely there is something you could do. So. What I try to convey here is that prenatal conditions, and I focus particularly on fetal growth restriction, are an opportunity. And I always say that. It's not they are a problem, but they are an opportunity. We are talking about probably 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 of pregnancies in our modern societies. We are making a lot of pregnancies survive that were not surviving in the past. Fetuses with problems that are making it. but they need to thrive in a very complex society. So they need to fulfill their potential as individuals, otherwise they will suffer a lot. Well, if they feel it, they will suffer equally, but anyway, not as much, at least when they are young. Then, we need to understand the mechanistic pathways, and there is a long way ahead of us, of course. I think biomarkers are very useful for research, and definitely it will be useful, because all these biomarkers which are not good for the individual level are very good to assess the impact of interventions. So we need these biomarkers at the level of research and the level of study groups. I think in a very short time we will have some clinical trials, but there is a challenge. So you need to define very well the condition, and there will be a session on growth restriction, but you will see growth restriction, it's an umbrella definition for different conditions. So you need to define very well your population as well, because if you don't randomize well, then you could end up with completely different postnatal environments that would change your outcome. So, and the intervention has to be very well defined as well. But I think we are quite close to that. And my impression has changed a lot. I thought in the past that we could individualize very much, and I think we will very, very far from that. Even for the heart, which is theoretically, and excuse me for the cardiologists here, simpler organ than the brain, at least in terms of function. At least we understand a little bit better how it works. It's very difficult to individualize. So it's much better, I think, to work on a public health level. Say, okay, these conditions are associated with a higher risk, and we should recommend these interventions, and this like folic acid in pregnancy. I think that could radically change the outlook of these children. But of course, we need to improve our understanding. I'm sorry I went 2 minutes over time. Thank you very much.
That was incredible. Thank you very much. Are there any questions, Dr. Braddock? We have
Hello, Jagjeet Teji from Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. Wonderful presentation combining both the fetal and the neonatal world and pediatrics. This could be applied to any organ system in the baby, not just the newborn brain, but the heart and the lungs and the kidneys and skin and anything else. Is there, I arrived a little late, I wanted to know conceptually, the health of the mother and the impact on fetal brain, like somebody's smoking for 20 years or drinking for 20 years or exposed to any other solvents and or environmental exposures. What would be the impact on the...
You mean the preconceptional period?
Yes.
Definitely there is a clear impact. I think reproduction, successful reproduction relies in 3 critical steps. One is conception, the other one is development of the fetus before birth, and the other one is the first years of age. And if you look in the natural environment, these are the critical, there is at least 10% failure in each of these natural steps. Definitely older mothers have higher prevalence of growth restriction. Mothers who suffered fertility problems, irrespective of the technique, have higher prevalence of preterm growth restriction, because all the phenomena that have to occur to ensure a successful pregnancy, that is this immunological interaction between the mother and the fetus, is not as efficient as it should be. Of course, if you have exposure to pollutants or toxic substances, that should have a great influence. There is, I think it's a very, it's becoming a very important line of research, and we are creating committees for environment in all perinatal groups now that should work during pregnancy, but also should be very important before conception. Definitely, that's a great influence.
Hi, I'm Margie Ream from Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus. There's different ways to get to induce fetal growth restriction. Do you think that there's a final common pathway, that all the different ways converge on the same mechanism? And how do you do it in the different animal models that you use?
Yeah, no, definitely. There is, as I said, we are, when a fetus is not, we already have problems to define what fetal growth restriction is, because we cannot measure it every week. this has proven to be a disaster. These velocity curves in utero do not work. They work with a child, but not in utero because we are using an imprecise method such as ultrasound. So this is a common definition. You are right, and you can arrive there through failure of the placenta. That happens in 60% of cases, but there is another 40% of cases in which we cannot really understand what's going on. And in the beginning, we said these are constitutionally small fetuses, but when we have followed them, we see that they have cardiovascular programming. They are also suffering neurodevelopmental delays, so they are not constitutionally normal babies, small babies. So what is going on here? Definitely, there must be reasons why the placenta gets old too early. There are some women in which there is not a good implantation. There are women in which there is a good implantation of the placenta, but there is, for whatever reason, there is premature aging of the placenta. And we need to understand what's going on. There are some big studies. We are performing one of those with 600 cases of growth restriction. We're trying to phenotype as much as we can the placenta, the maternal environment, and to understand. And when we do that, probably we will be able to classify much better what's going on. If you ask me, in animal models, you can, several groups, including ours, have tested what happens when you induce nutrient restriction, protein restriction, oxygen. When you combine them, you always induce problems, but they are not exactly the same. So there is always something going on, but the consequences might slightly differ. But in general, whatever you restrict before birth induces epigenetic changes. We need to understand how this works in humans. Yeah, no, it says that the micro is not working. That's why I can listen to you. No, I can't hear very well, of course. But
Thank you.
It's for the people in the back.
Very nice talk. I think you're asking the right questions, which many of us in basic science would like to illustrate with experimental models. One thing I've always wondered is to what extent you have a sort of double hit, in the sense, you said, for instance, that preterm delivery in animals can produce some of the alterations that we are seeing. Is it possible, like in autism, for instance, that you would have a double shock, in the sense that you have an insult and followed by preterm delivery, for instance? And the combination of both, what I'm trying to say is that, as you said, developmental sequences are crucial. You start some point, and then what happens it's not a straight line. And of course, the question is whether the consequence is due to the first or to the second insult or to both.
That is a great question, and I think definitely that's, as you say, it's always what happens in your life. It's always a combination of things. It's very difficult that just for one insult you get depressed, but if you have three, then definitely that's the case. It could be two prenatal or perinatal insults, or it could be one prenatal insult followed by a postnatal insult. So we have shown that again, and I'm sorry to go back to the heart so much, but we have shown that very clearly with the heart. So you have prenatal insult, and then if you take a lot of care of your postnatal environment and you take care a lot of your heart, everything, it's okay. It will reasonably well. But if you induce a second hit, you are not prepared to cope with it. So you go very quickly to pathological cardiovascular remodeling, much quicker than a normal person. So you could remain there for all your life. But if there is a second hit, this second hit could happen at the time of delivery with preterm labor, but we have as well shown that late onset growth restriction cases are suffering. So definitely this second hit is taking place after birth, and that's why not all these patients are having problems of neurodevelopment, because if you can as well correct them, leave them as they are, or put them worse, I'm fully convinced that all these prenatal mild conditions, which are the ones that are affecting the 10% of the population or the 15%, are really predispositions that as long as there is not a second hit will not make manifest. That's my impression. I could be wrong, but I think we agree with that. Thank you very much. Thank you.